Hello and welcome to the spiritguides.co.uk radio show with your host Mark Chatterton. Today I would like to welcome onto the show Ian R. Crane, who is a well-known researcher and speaker on the subject of geopolitics. Ian also has a personal interest in folklore, mythology and the belief systems of ancient and indigenous cultures. His knowledge of these belief systems has given him a unique insight into the unfolding evolution of humanity into a new plane of existence. And I'm sure today Ian will give us some clues about where humanity is heading. So welcome to the show, Ian.
Thanks very much indeed. I appreciate the invitation.
Right. Well, first of all, I know you lecture widely on the subject of geopolitics. For those listening that have never heard of the term, can you explain what geopolitics is?
Okay. Actually, my speciality is deep geopolitics, so it's probably
okay. So it's a bit more than that then.
Yeah. Geopolitics is basically the interrelationship between events unfolding around the world, which may appear in isolation to be random events. But by joining the dots, what I actually do is demonstrate that they're not random at all. They're part of a wider agenda. And geopolitics sort of tends to refer to what's occurring in the right here, right now, sort of immediate future. And the deep geopolitical agenda is looking at, basically what the game plan is for 10, 20, 50, 100 years and beyond. And of course, the reality is that the vast majority of people have some difficulty, because that's the way they've been conditioned, to think beyond the next paycheck or the next episode of their favourite soap or next sports match or whatever. And so those who are effectively the authors of these deeper agendas rely on people having very short attention spans.
Okay, because I know that you've worked in the oil industry for many years, and I understand that you were in Iraq, or maybe it was Kuwait. Kuwait at the end of the first Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein allegedly set fire to lots of oil wells, and yet at the time you weren't sure that this was really the case. Can you tell us about what happened then and how it changed your belief into what was really going on?
Well, I went into Kuwait on the flight, not having any real issue with the official version of events. Although perhaps I had some clues beforehand, and I'll share those with you in a second. But it was really only when driving around the southern oil fields in particular that the physical evidence certainly didn't support the official story. And as you rightly say, the official story was that the retreating Iraqi troops had set alight the Kuwaiti oil wells. But the evidence was somewhat different, and in fact, what I saw for myself was young Iraqi conscripts in foxholes that looked very much like defensive positions around the wellheads, and some of the wellheads were burning, some were gushing. But in many cases, the Iraqi conscripts were in the foxholes with bullet holes in the backs of their necks. So, the official version would require us to believe that these guys set the wells alight, then jump back in their foxholes and somehow managed to shoot themselves in the backs of their necks. The reality is that I had deep suspicions, obviously, that the official version could not be substantiated. And I was effectively threatened and told to keep my mouth shut. I mean, it was a benign threat. I mean, it wasn't direct. It was simply the suggestion that, I was on the payroll, and that, it would not necessarily be in my best interest to share these unsubstantiated concerns. It actually took me 12 years to get absolute corroboration when somebody who was a veteran of that first Gulf War had heard me doing an interview on my doubts about what really occurred. And this particular individual, via the US Veterans Association, forwarded who forwarded a letter to me stating that he indeed was one of the team of special forces that set the wells alight in Kuwait. And of course, people's first question is, why on earth would they do that? Well, there's two fundamental reasons. Number one is that the US administration under George Bush Sr. wanted to go all the way to Baghdad because the primary objective was to take Iraqi oil off of the global market and preferably, obviously, get it under US control. But the Arab nations were not prepared to support any invasion of Iraq, and they reminded Bush that the deal was to simply evict the Iraqi troops from Kuwait. So the retribution, if you like, was to set the wells alight, which served the purpose of demonizing Saddam Hussein in the eyes of the global community, which effectively led to sanctions, which of course were in place until the advent of the second Gulf War, which kicked off in 2003. So, Iraq, potentially being one of the largest oil-producing countries, was taken out of the equation because Saddam was seen as a loose cannon. And if he'd have flooded the market, then, of course, it would have caused the price of oil to fall dramatically. So by keeping his 4 million barrels a day off of the global market, it certainly helped sort of maintain prices at the higher level. The second reason that this was perpetrated, in my opinion, was to get the Emir of Kuwait to pay the US oil industry $7 billion to put the fires out. So, it's a classic case of problem, reaction, solution. Huh?
Yeah, so with the oil industry, with all your experience and everything, a lot of people are concerned about oil running out, and yet, on the other hand, other people say it won't run out. What's the sort of the thinking going on there? Is oil inexhaustible, or is it going to run out and we'll have to have other fuel sources, whatever?
Well, to talk about oil is really actually to talk about the wrong subject. What we should be talking about is hydrocarbons. And consequently, what you'll find is that the peak oil camp are constantly sort of changing their goals because 10 years ago, or even less, certainly 8 years ago, 2005, was a big year for people pushing the hypothesis of peak oil. And there were claims that, we would run out of oil by 2008 or 2010. And in fact, the price of oil went up dramatically in 2007 and 8 and peaking at $147 a barrel in July of 2008, and subsequently falling back to $35, and it now sits around just over $100 a barrel. The reality is that there are more hydrocarbons on this planet than we could ever sort of consider needing in the foreseeable future. But obviously what happens is that there's always low-hanging fruit. And then as you exhaust the low-hanging fruit, or your technology is such that you're not able to maximize the low-hanging fruit, then obviously you move into the next level of fruit. So what we've seen is, we've gone from the gushing wells of the likes of the Middle East and Texas to the slightly more difficult oil to extract on land, and then we moved offshore, and now, of course, there is the move to go to shale gas and coal bed methane. The reality is that, in my opinion, we have never, ever needed to consume anything like the 90 million barrels of hydrocarbons that are consumed every single day on this planet. The reality is that we are in the grip of a hydrocarbon banking government cabal that wants to sort of milk its monopoly. And this is a monopoly that has actually been in place for something in the region, certainly with the financial community of 100 years. But the J.D. Rockefeller really initiated this cabal back in the late 19th century. And once he'd established the effective control, the monopoly of the U.S. Oil industry and railroad transportation in the late 19th century, he wanted to make sure that he could maximize it. And then with the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913, the bankers got in on the act, and not least by obviously initiating a debt-based economy. But, that was a debt-based economy that was effectively being funded by the opportunity to tax on everything and anything from, income right through to obviously taxation on hydrocarbons. And if we look at the situation in the UK today, for example, the price of a litre of fuel is around about 130 something, and 80 odd pence of that is taxation. I mean, we effectively pay a mobility tax in this country. Every time you want to jump in your vehicle, you effectively undertake to pay a tax in excess of 80 pence on every litre of fuel. So whatever mileage you're getting per litre, I mean, for example, on my vehicle, I get about 9 or 10 miles to a litre. There's 80 pence tax on a litre. And so consequently, I'm paying effectively a tax of 8p or 8 or 9p for every mile that I drive. I mean, it's quite sort of easy to calculate. And when you consider that the 80 pence I'm paying in tax is more than the cost of a litre of fuel a decade ago, and yet our economy is still apparently, going down the proverbial, well, it is on a debt-based system, going down the proverbial tubes, then, you realise that something is very, very wrong. So, there's a number of issues here. First of all, we're not going to be running out of hydrocarbons anytime soon. And, in fact, the industry and the governments work to create the illusion that there is any real interest in moving towards renewables when, in fact, there isn't. 8% of the market is given over to creating that illusion. But the reality is that the only reason that the hydrocarbons industry is keen to promote the development of renewables is so that they can encourage entrepreneurs to put their developments into the arena, and then they can go buy them up and shut them down. It's, it is a game that they've been playing for a long time. And of course, the banks throw money into the economy. The central banks in particular throw money into the economy, and every pound or dollar or euro that's put into the economy is loaned into the economy, and it's loaned into the economy on the basis that governments have the means to extract the taxation to be able to repay those loans. But the reality is that in the UK, even since the current administration came into office, the level of debt has risen from 82% of GDP to 87%. And of course, whilst they claim they have slowed down the borrowing, the reality is they are still borrowing to excess, because we have this outrageous situation where all money coming in, being put into the economy, is loaned into the economy. And this is why there has been this global agenda, certainly of the last 20 odd years, which has been to effectively destroy all of the countries who were outside of this debt-based central bank economy. And so consequently, all of the countries that were deemed to be members of the axis of evil all had one thing in common, and that was that they were all outside of the central banking debt-based economy. They were all issuing their own currencies, and consequently, they were not in debt to the central bankers. And so, right now, Syria, if you look at the IMF's own accounts, it states categorically that Syria has no borrowing and therefore owes the IMF no money. And of course, it's the same with Iran. And all the countries that have been effectively wiped out by the spread of democracy, sorry, can't say that without laughing, like Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and of course Cuba and North Korea, Syria and Iran are basically the key countries that still remain outside of the central bankers' control, along of course with China and Russia.
So that basically there's what we would probably call the Western world with their economies on one side, and then these other countries like China, and Russia and a lot of Middle Eastern countries on the other side. What do you see as the future? How does that going to pan out, would you say?
Well, I think that actually it's very interesting that we have this interview now because, literally, I think the game changed just a few weeks ago. In fact, we can be very specific. The game changed at 10:30 on the evening of August 29th. And that was when, for the first time in 231 years, the sitting Parliament did not support the Prime Minister of the day in his call for a support to launch military action. And this was, of course, the vote that David Cameron had called to launch an attack against Syria, allegedly in retaliation for President Assad unleashing chemical weapons on his civilian population. The reality is that the evidence to support that claim doesn't exist. Increasingly, independent researchers, including myself, were stating categorically that there was absolutely no evidence to suggest that Assad was responsible for that event. It subsequently transpired, and to date this is the most plausible explanation, and it hasn't been refuted. And that is that the chemical weapons were actually provided to the rebels, the Western-sponsored rebels, by Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia. Unfortunately, he didn't also give them the instructions, the handling instructions. And so there appears to have been a very tragic accident in which a chemical weapon was released in a civilian area of Syria. And, of course, there were anything between 350 and 1,500 deaths. And, of course, the Western media immediately tried to pin it on Assad without a shred of evidence. David Cameron was clearly instructed to recall Parliament because he certainly didn't have the mandate to initiate any attack on Syria without a parliamentary mandate. And then something very significant occurred, and that is that people right across this country did something that in many cases they'd never done before. They got on the phone, or they got into their email, and they contacted their MP. Now, they may not have spoken to their MPs, but they will have certainly spoken to either their office manager or one of their researchers. And certainly the number of phone calls during the course of that day, August 29th, increased dramatically as the debate was going on in Parliament. And what transpired at 10:30 was very, very significant. David Cameron, of course, had called for a three-line whip, i.e. effectively an instruction for every member of the Tory party to support his call for military action. Some 32 Conservative MPs didn't turn up for varying reasons, but another 30 actually had the courage to vote against the party whip. And in many cases, these were MPs that were newcomers to Parliament in 2010. And so although they've been in Parliament for a little over 3.5 years or so, they are not necessarily totally ingratiated into the system. They haven't got their snouts perhaps as deep in the trough as some of the older hands. So a number of the 30 who voted against military action were the newcomers. And in fact, they have a collective name for themselves. They call themselves division meat because they're treated with disdain in Parliament. They're not given proper responsibilities. They are literally just treated as being there to vote as per the instruction of the party whip. So based on the phone calls, based on the emails and the letters that these MPs were getting, and all the other MPs were getting them as well, but these 30 had the courage to actually vote against the party whip. Now, the eventual result was 285 against any kind of military action and 272 in favour, which means that the majority was just 13. So the vote was rejected by just 7 MPs. If 7 MPs had voted differently, right now we would be having this discussion in a situation where the world would be effectively at war. Not just at war, but potentially in a debilitating global war. Now, thanks to the courage of those, I guess, 62 Tory MPs, because 32 of them, even though they didn't show up, they still had the courage not to show. But my absolute respect goes out to the 30 Tory MPs who had the courage to vote against David Cameron, because they had acknowledged their real responsibility of fiduciary trust, which means that they acknowledge that they have a responsibility to the people that elected them into office as their representative. So David Cameron had to do some pretty fancy footwork. In fact, as it so happens, I actually have right in front of me the letter that David Cameron sent out to all the Conservative MPs in the aftermath of that vote. And I won't read you the whole letter. But one paragraph, he says, "But as I said in the House of Commons yesterday, in the end, the British people and the British Parliament had to make a judgment. There is great scepticism about any involvement in the Middle East as people worry about our country getting sucked into the Syrian conflict. They do not want British involvement in military action. I get that, and I respect that." That said, I do know that some of those MPs that voted against have been vilified by the party whip. They are ostracised in some cases. So, David Cameron doesn't get it, and he doesn't respect it. He's pissed off, he's upset, and he's behaving like a spoilt child that he didn't get his way. And thank God he didn't get his way, because Obama wanted to use the David Cameron vote to effectively browbeat Congress and the Senate into supporting him to launch military action against Syria. Now, by the way, there is also quite some strong supposition that Israel tried to ignite the conflict by launching some missiles directly at Syria. Now, fortunately, the U.S. Navy that is in the Mediterranean managed to destroy these missiles before they were any threat, because there was sufficient awareness in the U.S. naval presence there that the British and the American electorate were not in any kind of mood for a global conflict, and despite Israel's desire to, Israel is a pariah state. Look at what Netanyahu has said. I think it was yesterday, that he's going to consider unilateral action against Iran, and yet in recent days, we've heard probably one of the most sensible speeches from any national president, from the president of Iran in recent days, where he's basically said, America has to stop behaving like a bully. America has to stop thinking that it can just attack any country that doesn't kowtow to its domination. And so consequently, he's opened the way for dialogue here. So the last few weeks have been very, very significant, and I think we always saw that this period in our evolutionary process was going to be significant, and some people were sort of thinking it was all going to come about by the flick of a switch, but that isn't the case. It's going to come about in ways that the establishment cannot predict. David Cameron went into Parliament on August 29th believing that he was going to get the support of Parliament for the vote. Obama believed that Cameron was going to get that, and they actually believed that they were going to be able to launch this attack, regardless of the potential consequences. And that has all changed. America is now being exposed as the bully, and this isn't the American people any more than Netanyahu represents the Jewish people. The Zionists hide behind the Jewish people. I feel tremendous sympathy for the Jewish people, because they are being used as a screen by these aggressive global corporatists, and it's the same in the US. The US people. I've lived in the US. I've lived in the Middle East. The US people do not support continued global hegemony being driven by their military, and consequently, what has occurred over, I think, the last few weeks is very, very significant. Obviously, there are still players who are trying to ignite this conflict. But hopefully, now that people have learned that they can step into their own power. And what that's going to take is actually get engaging in the process. And that means making the effort to contact their elected representative, regardless of what political party the representative is. I mean, the fact that you voted one way and you've got another representative in there, they're still your representative. And these elected representatives rely on people not contacting them. They want to have a free rein to do exactly as they feel, because if they don't get any contact, then hey, they can assume that apathy is consent. The moment that we step out of our apathy or willful ignorance and start to engage in the process and let our elected representatives know exactly how we feel on a given issue, then they have a responsibility, fiduciary trust, to actually acknowledge the views of their constituents. So I think this is very, very exciting times in many respects. We're not out of the woods by any stretch of the imagination yet, but we've come a long way in a very short time.
Yeah, because I would say, from what you were saying, we've sort of turned a corner, and there is hope for the future. It's not just all going to be wars and sort of economies falling and so on, but there is hope. But one thing I want to ask you is, you started the Alternative View conferences a few years ago, and there's one due to take place next year. Can you tell us a little bit about what the Alternative View movement's about and your role in it?
Yeah, the Alternative View is really about encouraging people, trying to stimulate people's own curiosity. And one of the differences between the mainstream media and the alternative community is that the mainstream media obviously wants to tell people what to believe. It wants to save them from the trouble of actually thinking for themselves. The alternative community operates in a completely different way, and we simply, in fact, we state categorically that we do not want people to take what we say at face value. That what we're trying to do is stimulate people's own curiosity, so they will take a look at these issues for themselves. And obviously, as they start to look at for themselves, then obviously they can decide, where it is they stand on a particular issue. But it will be based on actual knowledge, or research knowledge, rather than received knowledge or received information, because it's not even knowledge; it's just information. And in fact, one of the exercises that I do at one of my shift workshops is to get people to break down how much of their worldview is based on received information and how much is based on genuine knowledge and experiential knowledge. And when people realize how much of their worldview is based on received information, i.e. whether that's from the education establishment or from the media, it actually shocks them. And for many, obviously that is perhaps the pump primer for them to actually start the process of ensuring that, they either have the knowledge because they've put the effort into researching that particular issue, or they keep an open mind. There are a lot of things where we have to acknowledge that actually we don't really know. The establishment tells us what to think, but in reality, until we've looked at it, we don't really know. And if we can get people to acknowledge that, that's I think a tremendous part of the process. So AV5, yes, it is the first one I've run for over 4 years, but AV5 is going to be held next May in the heart of England, in Daventry, in Northamptonshire. And the whole idea really is to bring together, or to give people the opportunity to come together, spend effectively 2.5, 3 days in the company of like-minded people, to discuss, to share, to stimulate, and of course to educate, because we will have speakers who I consider to be at the forefront of their particular area of research. It's not going to be loaded with lectures. There will be time for people to socialise, for people who've come from particular areas of the country to get together, and for people who have common interests to get together. This is what it's a networking event.
Yeah, because I know that you're coming to Southend in November to speak at another conference, the Interdimensional Minds of Awareness conference. Can you tell us a little bit about what you'll be talking about there, perhaps?
Well, I guess I've touched on some of it. I mean, I shall certainly be building on the observation of what is happening right now, and obviously trying to maybe stimulate the curiosity so that we can accelerate it. But what we're living in is a very fast-moving agenda. We have issues that we have to focus on, much closer to home. I mean, one of the aspects that I've been focusing on for the past 12 months or so now is the agenda to bring shale gas and coal bed methane into the hydrocarbon resource pool of the UK. And unfortunately, these hydrocarbons can only be extracted by a process known as hydraulic fracturing, known as fracking. And from my experience in the oil industry, I know that wherever this process has been unleashed beneath a community, it has resulted in the contamination of water, of the soil, and of the air. And so consequently, I've been trying to encourage people to look at this issue for themselves, not believe or not take at face value the mainstream media hype that this is going to be the savior to Britain's energy crisis. Not that we have a crisis, but savior to Britain's energy problems. It's going to bring jobs. It's going to stimulate the economy, etc., etc. Whilst conveniently ignoring the irrefutable facts that it contaminates water, soil, and air, and leads to large tracts of countryside effectively being unable to sustain any life. So right now, it's just the end of the Balcombe campaign. I've spent about 30-something days at Balcombe over the past 2 months, where we were successful in delaying Quadrilla to the point where they were not able to conduct a frack, although they're going to be submitting planning permission and trying to get back in there to do a flow test, which will require a fracking job to be done. So elsewhere around the country, 64% of the UK sits above shale gas or coal bed methane. So this isn't an issue that is only going to impact on, say, Blackpool or Sussex. It's going to impact on a very significant chunk of the country. And if this agenda is allowed to go ahead, it will result ultimately in contamination of the water supply. It will deplete our water resources as well as contaminating the water, and it will lead to ultimate contamination of soil and air, just like it has everywhere else it's been unleashed across the planet. So this is also part of a much deeper agenda. Peter Brabeck, who is the chief executive, was the chief executive, he's retired now, I think, but he was the chief executive of Nestle, and back in 2005 he recorded an interview where he stated in that interview that in his opinion access to fresh water should not be regarded as a human right. Really what he was saying was that unless you're a slave to the corporations, to the global corporatists, then you shouldn't necessarily have or expect access to fresh water. He actually went on to say that he believed the same about air. And, I can see, again, where this is heading. If the shale gas agenda kicks off in the UK, we're not only going to be ever more reliant on the corporations for water, we are also ultimately going to be probably reliant on the corporations for breathable air. It's not beyond the realms of imagination to see that in 30, 40, maybe 50 years, air will become a commodity, just like electricity, gas, and water is today. I mean, 10 years ago, if you'd have told the people of Ireland that they would have to pay for their water, they would have laughed at you, because it had always been ingrained in Irish culture and tradition that water was provided by the state, even when the state was effectively the British government. But now the Irish are paying, like we in the UK, they're paying exorbitant sums of money to access water. And where this will go is, if you want to have access to breathable air in your corporate environment, then the corporations will pump it in, because obviously they want their people to be operating at maximum efficiency. If you want to have breathable air in your house, then basically it will be metered. And if you can't afford it, then you're just going to have to take your chances in whatever crap is in the atmosphere. And, we can see this already happening. I mean, obviously already the air pollution in cities is much greater than that in regional areas. And we even saw David Cameron suggesting that there should be a tax on people who live in the more pleasant areas. I mean, look, these guys are looking to literally tax the population on everything. The population to them is a human resource. I mean, they tell you, they spell it out for you. It's exactly how they view it. that humanity is a resource to be used, abused, and discarded at whim the moment it no longer makes a viable contribution. You know, we turned a corner probably 33 years ago, 34 years ago, maybe the late 1970s. That was the corner, and unfortunately, it's been pretty much, an increasing struggle for an increasing number of people ever since then.
Right. One final question, Ian, because I know you've explained quite a lot about what's going on in the world at the moment. I know you've got a deep interest in belief systems of ancient cultures. How would you say they've influenced your own views on human existence? And would you say you're being guided to make a stand in your own particular way?
That's very difficult. It's very difficult to pigeonhole or label my philosophy.
Yeah.
It doesn't really have an ism that you can attach to it. I mean, I am the perennial student. I mean, I'm always looking to learn. I'm always adding to my knowledge base. And every piece of knowledge that I add, inevitably will influence my philosophy in some way. I mean, suffice to say, do I feel that alone on this path? Absolutely not. There are many things that have occurred that I can't explain. And again, this is something that I actually look at, and I will be talking about actually this at the Southend event. We are fed information as to the way we're supposed to think. But actually, when we take a pace back and look at the thought process, and we look at the, if you like, the filter that we have of this very limited physical, empirical, material realm, and then we look at potentially what is occurring outside of that bandwidth, and once we permit ourselves to tap in to that wider arena, ostensibly using the right brain. I mean, we have an organ in our body that, in my opinion, is specifically designed to enable us to tap in outside of the physical, empirical, material realm. I mean, obviously, the establishment absolutely want to keep people locked into the left brain view, i.e. the ego, of this is all there is and that's it, there's nothing else. Whereas, ultimately, if people actually stop and they look at the experiences that they've had in life, they will realize that, every single one of us has had experiences that actually the left brain can't explain. And once the left brain actually sort of gets out the way and sort of acknowledges that there's a whole bunch of stuff that it can't explain, but it also can't deny. And then it's like all things, practice enables, I won't say enables you to become perfect, but, you don't become a seventh Dan martial artist overnight. Neither do you become a seventh Dan martial artist just by thinking about it. You actually have to, put in the work and the effort in the physical realm, but there's also a lot of other stuff that you need to embrace. And, consequently, in martial arts, they have, I think it's the term tatsudin, which is the point of perfect balance. And it's the same, again, using the martial arts analogy. If you have an opponent, you don't need to exert any of your own energy to defeat them. You effectively use the energy that they're putting in to try to bring you down and turn that against them. And that's exactly, I think, the situation that we have right now in the unfolding arena. There is energy that the establishment is putting in to try and take us in one direction. We don't actually need to put up a counter energy. We simply need to turn the energy and the effort that they're putting into something and use that to get it into a direction that is more beneficial to collective humanity.
Right. Well, on that note, I'd like to say thank you ever so much for being interviewed by us today. And it's fascinating, all the stuff you've said to us. And I hope that people listening will act on that and try and go a bit deeper, find out more that's happening, and look at your website, which I believe is ianrcrane.com.
That's correct. That's correct. And absolutely. I mean, let me re-emphasize. I do not expect and would not want anyone to take anything that I've talked about here at face value. They've no need to. For the last 15 years, we've had access to an amazing tool. I'm not sure how much longer we're going to have access to it, or how much longer it's going to be quite as, let's say, liberal as it is right now. So let's make use of it. We don't have to put in requests at libraries to get books. That can always be useful, but we do have access to information through the internet, so let's use it.
Right. Well, thanks ever so much, Ian.